That's really what you got.
Meeting in this work session to, sorry, my computer died. Talk about the data assessments. And I think we'll, Superintendent, can you kick us off?
Yes, thank you. Good evening, directors. Thanks for dedicating some time this evening in work session. This is intended to be learning opportunities. I mean, we are all interested in modeling those attributes of a good learning organization, and part of that means reviewing our performance indicators, student achievement, outcomes. One pledge we've made to the board's affirmation of board goals, academic milestones in grades 3, 5, 8, post-secondary, is to give you along the way some progress monitoring indicators, share with you interims as they occur, whether or not they're a formal board goal or not, any information that gives you a sense of sort of the pulse in the school system. And so tonight, we have a dedicated session. It's really going to focus on our fall assessment data. This is our MAP assessment data as published by NWA. So we do have some guest expertise here, team that works with us directly and folks from the NWA office. Their national office is actually right across the bridge here in Portland. So we're thankful to have their expertise. If I could have them introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Mariah Demers. I'm the account manager who's been working with Portland Public for the past 4 years. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. And hi, everybody. I'm Nate Jensen, the director of one of the research teams at UCLA.
So we appreciate having them not just for our own internal conversations, but also as we dive deeper into the achievement of the assessment data, especially at the school level, help in interpreting and understanding what the data is telling us. It's invaluable to continue to have their technical assistance. So tonight we're really going to dive into the fall assessment data. We're starting to have great conversations internally about sort of how do we interpret this, and then I anticipate that you're probably going to ask a lot of predictable questions that we are starting to ask of ourselves about what it might be telling us, and that's a great place, hopefully objective for the night, is that we end up with a whole set of next layer of questions, because we want to keep providing more and more data and information that we can that gives us an accurate assessment of the district's capacity and work with impact on the goals that we have for our students. So taking the lead tonight is, thank goodness he's here, our Chief of Research Assessment and Accountability, Dr. Renard Adams, who I know has shared with you an initial slide deck before he dives into the MAP data, just because there's been a lot of questions around enrollment fluctuations, not just in Oregon, but here in PPS. We'll spend a little time on that. And then he'll walk you through the grade level by grade level, content by content MAP assessment results. And just because we know that it will provoke a question around, well, how does PPS's performance compare compared to other districts, our urban districts around the country? So we have the benefit of NWA, who will also speak to that and what they're noticing across a sample set of 6 million students as well. So, Renard, all yours.
Well, good evening, Madam Chair, board directors, student representative Weinberg, and thank you for that great introduction, Superintendent Guerrero. I'm pleased to be with you tonight to go through one of our first regularly scheduled data dives. We'll be coming back and having these several times during the school year moving forward. The team and I will be happy to take any questions that you have at the end of the presentation. I'm having some technical difficulty. Give me 1 second. Kara, I might need help.
Because you're looking at the Zoom meeting there, you want to be on your Google screen.
Okay. That's not advancing.
But it's on the Zoom screen right now, I think.
Yeah.
Can you pull up just your Google Form?
I'm using PowerPoint. Do I need to use Google?
Nope, it should, just if you pull your PowerPoint
Yeah, but I have got a book.
to the front of the. So you can hide the Zoom. Events now?
And he's like, you know what? I'm
Yeah.
Okay, now you need to
tell nobody on the
find the Zoom icon, share your screen.
I got it.
I'll go to coffee with you.
We need to get on the coffee table.
That's my, so that's, we have a book that we have to read every month. This is my book this month. And then this is the book I each have to read next
Takes me out of it.
So you gotta get through it in a month.
month. Can you have it done by December 1st?
Can you minimize the screen again?
My wife. Yeah,
Oh,
we each pick
You
a book
guys
for
have
each
your
other.
book club.
Mm-hmm.
That's not what.
Yeah.
So now, yeah, I see what.
You know, my sister has a really good, I'll have to tell you this. My sister has a really interesting, your sister Paula.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, whoever I can do.
That's right. Okay, so
In that case.
It advances when I'm not sharing the screen.
Will allow you to advance the menu.
There we go.
Um,
No,
Can you advance the menu?
no, I cannot.
That's fine. Did you hear what you said?
As soon as you share your screen, it takes you to the Zoom.
you know, they.
Right, and it was working perfectly when we tested it earlier.
If you wanna get it. It's simple.
Sam Thompson.
Kara, I'm gonna leave the meeting and come back in, see if that helps.
I can,
I'll share it. It's just like that, if I can.
Are you able to share it from there, Carol?
Can I, send you the PowerPoint?
He really is.
The one you have on, that was sent out, this afternoon to the board will be fine. And if you could advance, that'd be great.
You just have to stay next slide.
That was my neighbor for about,
Here, I know several things.
Okay.
right next to,
Yeah, maybe doesn't.
yeah, Sam Thompson. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know.
Oh, you do, you do.
Yeah, I know. I get very much, very much. That's why I just, well, the whole issue today, well, that, yeah.
I was thinking about it.
Yeah, yeah.
I was thinking about using.
Yeah, I was able to. This. But I got a message from a student saying,
I got a Zoom link from Kara earlier. I was in there and I tested it earlier and we're fine. I'm not sure what's happening there.
his management, we also put some students outside. And so I had to interact with those students that were outside. It was, police were trying to talk to them, they were trying to talk to the police. So then it's like,
Okay, I think we're ready to go again. So again, thank you for the opportunity to go through the fall data dive with you tonight. Kara, if I could have the next slide, please. In thinking about available data and what could be shared with board directors, we really had the following guiding questions. What is our current enrollment compared to last year's actual and this year's projected enrollment? What is the new baseline of performance for our students? And that's of course based on our fall MAP assessments. And finally, how did the class of 2021 perform on post-secondary indicators of college and career readiness? We know there's been a lot of interest in data, and I know you all have been waiting for me to get here to have a database conversation, so let's just dive right on in. Next slide, please. Let's begin with enrollment. Each October 1st, we count the number of students enrolled in PPS. If you could go back one.
Oh, sorry.
And these enrollment data are then shared with ODE and determine our state share of student funding. As you are aware, enrollment drives revenue, which drives resources, both human and material, that we can allocate to school, buildings, and communities. While our October 1st enrollment has been publicly reported, we wanted to take a moment to look at some enrollment comparisons used by the district to determine resource allocation. Next slide, please. According to ODE's most recently published report, statewide student enrollment is down. There were 580-some thousand students enrolled in Oregon Public Schools on the first day of school of October 2019. And in October 2020, there were almost 22,000 fewer students enrolled. Prior to the pandemic, there had been a gradually slowing increase in the public school enrollment, but the pandemic conditions have led to a drop. PPS, like districts across the state and country, has also seen a decrease in enrollment since the onset of the pandemic. Next slide, please. There we go. Thank you. Annually, PPS partners with the Population Research Center at Portland State University in order to produce enrollment projections and forecasts for the next 14 years. The Population Resource Center has calculated our district enrollment projections since 1999. Projections account for changes in school configuration, like adding a new grade, new school or program, and it also accounts for neighborhood changes such as known housing development. When PPS meets enrollment projections, revenue and resources, including staffing, are in alignment and no current or future adjustments are typically needed. However, when PPS enrollment does not meet projected enrollment, revenue can decrease and staffing and resource adjustments may occur based on the extent and magnitude of the difference between actual and projected enrollment. This slide shows grade bands K through 5, 6 through 8, and grades 9 through 12, as well as K-12 totals. 2020 actual enrollment, 2021 projected enrollment for this year, and 2021 actual October enrollment for this fall, as well as the differences between those are shown on the screen. As you can see, our 2021 actual enrollment is down as compared to both 2020 actual enrollment and the 2021 enrollment projection. While this decline is in keeping with statewide trends, PPS's decline in enrollment appears to be greater in magnitude than our neighboring districts based on conversations with the Population Research Center. Depending on our projected enrollment for fall 2022, revenue and resources may be impacted. So the question of interest is, where are the students? And the answer is, we really don't know. They don't appear to be in our neighboring districts. They don't appear to be in the state. We're not sure where they've gone. If I can have the next slide, please. And so conclusions and takeaways is that our enrollment is down, as I shared. We are in discussion with the Research Center to understand and refine our enrollment projections because we do staff based on projections. So we want to make sure those are as accurate as they can be moving forward. And the pandemic has caused fluctuations in the model that have led to the inaccuracies that we've experienced so far. So we want to see how much we can correct that. And then this idea that we may experience some revenue adjustments going into the next school year, depending on decisions that the state and ODE may make around revenue and funding. If I could have the next slide, please. Before we look at our fall assessment data, I would like to remind directors of the impact of COVID-19 and what it has had on data availability, especially our reading and mathematics math data. The chart on the screen shows the past 3 years and where we were and were not able to complete the MAP assessments. Prior to the school closures and the shift to distance learning in March 2020, we were able to complete the administration of the MAP assessments in each required window. During the 2021 school year, when instruction was virtual and then hybrid, we were only able to remotely administer the MAP assessments during the winter window only. This remote administration had a much lower student participation rate than the previous in-person assessment administrations. During the spring of 2021, assessments were canceled due to feedback and concerns stemming from the pandemic. The good news, though, this year we've been able to assess students because students are back in school for in-person instruction, and we've completed that testing. And while the pandemic has limited our ability to understand student growth and achievement in the past, this reopening gives us an opportunity to reset a baseline and move forward. If I could have the next slide, please. Establishing a new baseline is going to be critical as we move forward. Research and assessment organizations such as NWA, who are here with us tonight, and Curriculum Associates, the makers of iReady, have completed some research inquiries, and those were shared with board members previously. And for our purposes, we'll briefly examine some findings from our partners at NWEA before diving into our fall assessment data. If I could have the next slide, please. So what might we expect? As I mentioned, NWA did research into student performance during the 1920 school year and the fall of 2021. The image on the slide shows some of this research. Beginning with the school closure in March 2020, we can see different levels of unfinished learning as depicted by the dotted lines between school closure and the last day of school. As we know, COVID-19 has differentially impacted students in their learning, and so multiple degrees of unfinished learning are depicted. The time frame between the last day of school and the first day of school for the next school year demonstrates the typical summer slides that students experience. However, again, due to the differential levels of unfinished learning, the amount of summer slide is more or less pronounced for different students. And finally, when fall map assessments were administered at the start of the 2021 school year, some students tended to show lower student achievement as compared to their achievement prior to the onset of the pandemic. If I could have the next slide, please. NWA continued its research and examined student average RIT scores and growth for the 2021 school year, shown by the dotted line, compared to the 2019-2020 school year, which is shown with the dotted line. The 2021 school year is the solid line. Among their findings were, while students demonstrated growth, the growth was at a lower rate and the achievement was at a lower level than prior assessment windows. Student achievement at the end of virtual instruction during the 2020-21 school year was lower than student achievement prior to the pandemic. In essence, students' performance had not yet been accelerated back to or above pre-pandemic levels. So this tells us that our focus on learning acceleration is exactly what we need to do and is critical to our collective ability to accelerate our students back to where we expect them to be. Next slide, please. Now let's take a look at how we're currently achieving. We're going to start with reading and then go into math data. Right now we have achievement data because we only have one data point because we're starting over with a new baseline. Once we've done the winter assessment, we'll be able to come back and talk about growth data. If I could have the next slide, please. In PPS, we assess reading performance for students in grades 3 through 8. We start with grade 3 as this is a critical year for students in reading acquisition. We expect and want all students to be proficient by the end of their 3rd grade year. Research tells us that students who are not reading proficiently in grade 3 are 4 times more likely to drop out of school prior to graduation. This is even more pronounced for Black and Latinx students who, when not reading proficiently, are 8 times as likely to drop out as compared to proficient readers. Reading is a gateway skill that makes all other learning possible, from complex text to technical manuals, mathematics, real-world problems, and beyond. If I can have the next slide. First, we'll look at overall performance across the grade levels, and I want to talk a little bit about the RIT score so we understand what we're talking about and what I'm mentioning in the data that you're seeing. So the MAP assessment produces what we call a RIT score, and it's a scale score, and RIT stands for Roush Instructional Unit. The MAP trainers will also tell you that RIT stands for Ready for Instruction Today, and that unit is an equal interval unit, so you can do math with it. The difference between 190 and 191 is the same difference between 200 and 201. And so that allows you to do computation, which is important. The average RIT score for each grade is shown in green, and then the target score for that grade level is shown by the yellow dot. So for example, the RIT score value for each grade is shown at the base of the bar. So 3rd grade reading has an average RIT score of 192. Compared to an expected RIT score of 188. So this is good news. Overall, across grades 3 through 8 in reading, despite the pandemic and its effect on student learning, our students are performing above, they're exceeding that expectation shown by the yellow dots. That said, when we disaggregate the data, a different achievement story will emerge. If I could have the next slide, please. For grade 3 reading, the expected level of student performance based on fall assessments is a RIT score of 188, which is shown by the yellow target line. All students are Asian, multiracial, and white students. All either met or exceeded this expectation. Gaps exist, however, between our students of color and the expected level of achievement and their peers. As compared to the grade 3 fall normal level of achievement, Black and Native students' achievement was similar to the expected achievement at the fall or the beginning of 2nd grade. Moreover, as a group, our underserved students of color demonstrated performance that would typically be expected during the winter or the middle of the second grade year. If I could add the next slide and we look at grade 4.
So half a year.
Half a year, yes.
Also, it looks like the yellow line isn't at 190.
It isn't. This is a rendering problem that happens when we turn it into
Okay.
PDF.
Okay.
If I could show you my beautiful PowerPoint, it would look a lot better.
Yeah, because I was like 198. That's super close to 196 for 80. But it looks like a huge gap.
I noticed that today too.
So in grade 4, again, you'll see a similar pattern all through reading. The all-student group, the multiracial students, and the white students will exceed the expectation. And here in grade 4, you'll note that those similar gaps exist as we saw in grade 3. Here in grade 4, Black, Latinx, and Native students are demonstrating performance akin to what we would expect the fall of grade 3. And underserved students of color are doing slightly better and demonstrate performance similar to the winter or the middle of the third grade year.
I have a quick question. On the underserved students of color, is that the same kids as Black and Latinx as well? Is that part of the same
It's all the students of color together. Great question.
All together, okay.
Mhm.
Actually, sorry, can I ask a clarifying? When you say underserved students of color, is it all students of color? Because I thought it only included some sets of students of color that were historically underserved.
My understanding is this is all students of color, but let me get back to you on that. I can send a message and find that out. I'm sorry.
That's a good
Yes.
question.
The expected achievement, if we look at, if I can have the next slide, please. The expected achievement for the fall of grade 5 is a RIT score of 206. Again, the following student groups met or exceeded this expectation. All students, multiracial students, Asian and white students. Underserved students of color demonstrated performance similar to the fall of the 4th grade year, while Black, Latinx, and Native students' performance was similar to what we would expect during winter of the 3rd grade.
So make sure I understand. So this number for the Black kids, you're saying is what, even though they're in the 5th grade, these numbers is basically what their act is at 3rd grade now.
Winter, middle of the 3rd grade year, yes.
And
And
so what we're seeing is the rate, the degree to which they're behind is compounding as they get older.
Yes,
Yes,
that is what
yes.
we will see and what I'll highlight. What's also important, and I should have noted this earlier, is the degree of difference becomes more magnified as the grade level increases.
Yes.
So a kindergarten student would be expected to make 16 or 17 points of growth in a year, where when you get to 7th or 8th grade, there's only 4 or 3 points of growth expected for the entire school year, so that for an entire group to be not performing by 3, 4, 5, 10 points is a huge gap.
Mhm. I saw that in the data. It seems to be, yeah, it's compounding, I guess.
It does. The gaps increase as the grade levels go up, so I'm going to sound a little bit like a broken record, but I want to make sure we understand just how far away from expectations students are at each of the grade levels and in the subjects. If I could have the next slide, please. In grade 6, again, we see that all students, Asian students, multiracial students, and white students met the expected RIT score with a score that was greater or equal to 211. Native students, in this grade were closer to grade level performance than other students of color. Their performance was similar to winter of the 5th grade year. Underserved students of color and Latinx students demonstrated achievement similar to what we might expect in the spring of grade 4. And our Black student achievement was the furthest from grade level expectations for performance similar to the winter of the 4th grade.
Except English language learners.
Right, their performance is even a little lower. Mhm.
I have a question about, so the gap, we see what the target is, we see what the actual score is. The actual score in aggregate, and is it the average?
It's the average.
It's the average, okay.
Can I have the next slide, Kara, please? Thank you. In grade 7, the similar pattern emerges with the groups that we've already mentioned, meeting or exceeded the expected RIT. Here, our Black and Native students showed the greatest gaps in achievement, with performance more in line with what we expect to see in fall of the 5th grade year. Our underserved students performed only slightly better with achievement similar to what is expected in winter of grade 5. And finally, in grade 8, if I could have the next slide, Kara. Lastly, for reading in grade 8, Black students had the lowest level of achievement with an average RIT score that would typically be seen in winter of the 5th grade. And while underserved, Native, and Latinx students' achievement was in line with the expectations of the winter of grade 6. As with other grade levels, here we see that the all students group, Asian students, multiracial students, and white students met or exceeded the expected RIT with a score of 219. Next, we'll dig into math. And Kara, if I could have the next slide. We assess math in grades 2 through 8. Mathematics provides an effective way of building mental discipline and encourages logical thinking, logical reasoning, critical thinking and problem solving. Analytical and reasoning skills are important because they help us solve problems and look for solutions. So ensuring the students can compute and reason in ways that demonstrate ongoing readiness toward college and career and our graduate portrait is critical to student success. If I have the next slide, please. Overall, mathematics performance tells a slightly different story than reading performance, where in reading, each grade level met or exceeded the RIT. Here in math, only grade levels 2 and 8 on average met the expectation, and all of the other grade levels approached but did not meet the expected RIT target. We'll disaggregate these data like we did with reading. If I could have the next slide, please. So we have an extra grade level here because we're looking also at grade 2. The target RIT for second grade math is 177. On average here, the all students group, Asian students, multiracial students, and white students exceeded this expectation, and all other students missed the target. Black students demonstrated performance that would be expected in the fall of first grade or 1 year below expectations. Latinx and underserved students of color demonstrated performance similar to what would be expected winter of first grade. And Native students' performance was similar to what would otherwise be expected in the spring of kindergarten. If we could look at the next slide. In grade 3, in grade 3, mathematics, only our white students met and exceeded the target expectation with a RIT score of 190. All students group, Asian and multiracial students, approached this expectation but did not quite meet it, and that'll be a pattern going forward where they're close but not quite there. In this grade, underserved students of color and Native students showed performance similar to what would be expected in fall of grade 2, and Black students demonstrated on average performance that would be expected in the winter of the first grade or almost 2 years below what we would typically expect. If I could have the next slide. Grade 4 student group performance was similar to grade 3, with only our white students exceeding the expected level of achievement and the other subgroups approaching that expectation but not making it. Here, underserved students of color, Latinx students, and students who identify as Pacific Islanders demonstrated performance on par with the spring of second grade, while Black and Native students were further below grade level expectations, with performance similar to what would be expected in the winter of second grade. If I could have the next slide, please, Kara. Here in grade 5, we again see our white students exceeding the expected level of achievement with a RIT score of 210. And Asian students, all students, and multiracial students again approaching but not meeting those expectations on average. For this grade level, Latinx students and underserved students of color both demonstrated achievement that is expected during the winter of grade 3. Black students, Native students, and Pacific Islander students' performance was more similar to what would typically be expected in the fall of grade 3. If I have the next slide, please. Looking at grade 6, the pattern continues unchanged. Again, our Asian students, all students, and multiracial students are approaching that expectation. Here, our Latinx and underserved students of color showed achievement that would typically be expected in the beginning of the 4th grade year, while Black and Native students' achievement was furthest below grade level expectations, with achievement that was typical of what we would see in the winter of 3rd grade. If we could take a look at grade 7, Kara, please. We see slightly improved performance for some student groups, with Asian, multiracial, and white students exceeding the expected achievement, and the all students group approaching that expected performance of 221. Underserved students and Latinx students demonstrated achievement typically expected in the spring of grade 4, and Native students demonstrated performance similar to achievement we would see in the winter of grade 4. Black students again demonstrated the lowest achievement level with achievement similar to what we'd expect at the beginning of the 4th grade year in the fall. And finally, for 8th grade mathematics, again, Asian students, multiracial students, white students, and the all students group met or exceeded the expectation level with a RIT score of at least 226. Here, our Native students showed higher levels of achievement and approached the expected RIT, but didn't quite get there with achievement typically which would be seen in the fall of 7th grade. Underserved, Latinx, and Black students showed on average lower achievement. Again, Latinx and underserved students of color demonstrated performance typically seen in the winter of grade 5, and Black students demonstrated the lowest achievement with a RIT of 206, which would typically be expected in the winter of 4th grade or nearly 4 years below grade level expectations.
Can I just put a little placeholder in here? Sorry. A little placeholder in here. You know, I don't know if you guys have had the opportunity to do this yet, but it'll be so interesting to look at the subgroups that have made disproportionate gains in 1 year, because for the most part, we're seeing just gaps compound over time, but then we're seeing certain subgroups in certain years making up for lost ground. So it would be kind of interesting to see the extent to which we can identify influences or supports or investments that maybe had something to do with that.
Sure.
So that's
Absolutely.
just something for later.
Yeah, I'd like to see like grade versus RIT score and then have different line graphs of the demographic group so we can see the like rate of improvement by each grade for each demographic.
Sure. So we need multiple data points to show you
Yeah.
that trend line, and we just have this one as our first baseline. But it's certainly something we can do in the future moving forward. Absolutely. If I could have the next slide, please, Kara. It's our conclusion slide for this section. So in the aggregate, as we shared, reading achievement is exceeding that grade level expectation. In the aggregate, although those persistent gaps exist among our student groups. In math, the math achievement was lower than grade level expectations in all grades except 2 and 8. And then our students of color show greater levels of unfinished and interrupted learning in reading and math. And they're often demonstrating achievement that's far below grade level expectations. At this time, I'd like to invite Dr. Nate Jensen, Director of Research for NWA, to briefly share what they're seeing nationally in the data. Kara, if we could have the next slide. And the next one, excuse me.
I'll just yell at you from back corner here if that works. Okay? So we're good?
We can hear you.
Okay, cool. So thank you for having me. I appreciate the time. I'm going to try and be brief. One of the things I wanted to do is just share 3 slides that draw from our national research that's set to be released on Monday. And I chose these 3 slides to provide context for what Dr. Adams just talked about, the big high-level trends that are emerging in PPS, and how we might juxtapose those relative to what we see across the nation. So everything I'm going to show you here is comparing where kids were in fall of 19 compared to where kids are now. I'm taking a little bit different of approach. So let me just unpack what you're seeing here on the slides just for a moment. So here we're showing overall shifts in reading and math. And if we could focus on the arrow on the left, there's kind of 3 pieces of information that I want to draw your attention to. The first is the top of the arrow, the circle at the top, which is, I realize, kind of hard to see here, but if you have the slides in front of you, it's great. The circle represents where achievement was in reading in 3rd grade in fall of 19. We're expressing everything relative to our norms. So this is expressed in terms of achievement percentages. If you look at 3rd grade reading, you can see 3rd graders in reading in fall of 19 were at about the 50th percentile, what I might characterize as slightly above average achievement. Nationally, what we've seen then in fall of 21 is a decline in achievement, about 7 percentile. That tip of the arrow tells us where kids are now in 3rd grade reading. And that number below it tells us what the shift in percentile looks like. So in third grade reading, we've seen the shift in fall 19 from slightly above average achievement to slightly below. What I want to draw your attention to then is a couple of things. First, we see that irrespective of grade, irrespective of subject, we see declines in achievement in fall 19 compared to fall 21. Fall 21 compared to fall 19. But what we also see is a much more notable impacts in math. And this is consistent with lots of different research on this topic, that there appears to be clear impacts of the pandemic that have hit harder, more so in mathematics than what we observed. Fairly consistent with what Dr. Adams talked about here. What I think is important, though, is to look below the surface at some of these numbers. So next slide, please. I want to present the same information, but just disaggregating between two groups of students. Students in low poverty schools, where less than 25% of students are eligible for free and reduced lunch, versus students in high poverty schools, where 75% or more of students are eligible for free and reduced lunch. When we look at those two student groups, there's a couple of trends that become apparent. The first thing I would point out, if we're focusing on reading, is that if you remember, that circle tells us where kids were in fall of 19. And if we look at the circles in low poverty schools versus high poverty schools, you can already see that there is huge differences in achievement as of fall of 19. To the point where kids in low poverty schools were well above average achieving versus kids in high poverty schools were well below average achieving. What makes this slide so important is when we look at the magnitude of declines for those two groups of students. And what we see is that students in high poverty schools showed much greater declines for fall 19 and fall 21 than did students in low poverty schools. Certainly the impacts are more notable in math, but I'd also draw your attention to elementary schools, especially in high poverty schools, where we see the most substantive declines. As we look for areas of need, as we look for areas where greater investment of resources are needed, this is one kind of clear call to action that we're seeing in our research. We don't need to belabor it, but the next slide, please. I'll just put this up here as well. We also disaggregated our results by race and ethnicity, with Asian students on the left and Black students on the right. We presented this information this way to really underscore that these kids in fall 19 were starting at a much different place, with notable differences in achievement when we look left to right. And the declines in achievement have been much more heavily felt for students, our Hispanic, our American Indian, Alaska Native, and Black students, more so than our white Asian students. This to me is the other clear call to action. I said this morning, but in our research, we talk about how in a world in which everyone wants to go back to normal, normal's not going to be good. There's kind of clear calls to action here that as we think about how we're investing our resources, what we're focusing on, there are clear patterns that are emerging that require our attention. So obviously we have more research to share. We'll share that on Monday, but just wanted to give a brief glimpse just to give you some context for what we're seeing here. Thanks, Dr. Adams.
Thank you, Dr. Jensen. And as he mentioned, we know that we had gaps prior to the pandemic here in PPS, and we can only now begin to understand what those pandemic effects have done to those gaps as we move forward. If I could have the next slide, please.
Clarifying question. I want to make sure that I'm understanding the data, and I'm just sort of taking this in. One of the aggregate takeaways for PPS was that reading achievement exceeds grade level expectations, and then there's this when we disaggregate these serious gaps. From the national context, I see reading, dropping across the board during the pandemic. Is that also based off of grade level expectation? I guess what I'm getting at is PPS in aggregate doing better than nationally, or do we readjust our grade level expectations based on where we thought kids were going to be as a result of the pandemic? I know you sort of said this is the beginning. That's right.
So I'll take a stab at that. So NWA has a large sample of student performance data in their data lake. I think it's somewhere between 11 and 15 million students that are included in their nationwide sample. And so when we are comparing our third graders in reading to that RIT score, we're comparing them to the performance of those 11 to 15 million students as the national average. And so you can say in the aggregate, we're exceeding in reading those national average based on RIT score performance. What Dr. Jensen shared was percentile rank. And if you remember that when you were in the 80th percentile, it meant that you scored better than 80% of the students, you know, who similarly took the test. And he's showing that one of the ways we can look at what has happened to student achievement is look at the differences between the percentile ranks between those 2 years. We did not do that for PPS data for tonight, but it is another way we can understand the impact of the pandemic on student achievement.
And just to add a bit of one of the things that we're working with PPS in collaboration on is looking at those kind of questions, like what trends do we see in PPS over time versus what trends do we see across the nation? Really give context for how do the trends we see here compare. So we'll have more information for folks at PPS here soon.
Thanks. Let's talk about post-secondary readiness. This is some good news. If we could have the next slide. This is, of course, a board goal that we will move our underserved students of color from 50.3% of them meeting post-secondary or demonstrating post-secondary readiness to 56% successfully completing one or more of those indicators. If we could have the next slide, please. Just a reminder of the various ways that students could indicate or demonstrate post-secondary readiness. They could successfully complete 3 or more advanced placement courses, 3 or more IB courses, 3 or more dual credit courses, successful completion of a CTE pathway, which is 2 or more courses in the same path, or successful attainment of the seal of biliteracy. So there are 5 different ways that can go into the aggregate performance of students here. Students can hit one of the indicators or 2 or 3 of them, and each of those students will be considered to be ready for a post-secondary college or career. If I could have the next slide, please. So the overall readiness is shown on the slide for the classes of 2020 and 2021. The board goal of 56% is shown by the red line and the red call out. The good news is our historically underserved students of color improved the percentage at demonstrating post-secondary readiness with an increase of 14 percentage points over the class of 2020. And in doing so, we've met the board goal a year prior to where we initially expected to meet that board goal. This is great news, but we know we have more work to do. We also see increases above the board, almost across the board in all of the student groups. So in the aggregate, we're moving in the right direction in terms of post-secondary readiness. Again, we'll disaggregate this by race and by the indicators of post-secondary readiness so we can understand how each of those are looking. With these data, the question will become, what would be considered good? Good would be this chart with 100% across the board for all the student groups. As we look at each of the individual components, good is then relative because we know students need to meet one of those components, and we know we don't have, for example, IB in all schools. We don't have programs everywhere, and so you have multiple pathways, but not necessarily multiple equal access across the board to this date.
But to that point, I was just thinking about exactly that, which is this indicator is different than everything else we've looked at before because it's not just about achievement, it's also about access and opportunity and achievement.
Yes.
And so we can measure a considerable amount of progress in terms of providing those opportunities for our students, even though we're not there yet. So it's worth noting that that's a course in a different color.
If I could have the next slide, please, Kara. This is these are our data for AP pass rates. Despite the pandemic, our pass rates continue to increase for our underserved students of color, increasing by 10 percentage points from a little over 11% to 21.4% between the classes of 2020 and 2021. And there are also these AP pass rates are increasing for all of our student groups, save our students with disabilities and our English learners. Where you don't see a data bar, that means that fewer than 5% of students met that indicator, and so the data are therefore suppressed.
So this slide speaks exactly to that point about access and opportunity.
And as will all the slides that come after this. If I could have the next slide.
So these are not percent of people who could have accessed it, but it's all high school students.
This is actually the percent of the graduating class.
Okay.
So of that graduating class, of the African American students, what percentage of African American students met the indicator of the AP course? In IB, the percentage of underserved students of color passing IB was flat, actually, between 2020 and 2021, hovering around 7%, and decreased slightly by 1 percentage point for all students combined. And of note, you'll note the student groups that don't necessarily have data for 1 or more years.
I'm curious, if you had a bar that had, like taking the course versus passing it, would we see like a big increase in those taking the courses? Or are we having more kids, same number of kids taking a class, but more passing?
I don't want to speculate without actually looking at the data, but I will share what I've seen nationally and talking to the College Board about this. What we often see is students will enroll in the class, and then sometimes they'll drop the class, sometimes they'll finish the class, but they won't take the exam. We see that happening more likely, more often with students of color. So we would have to do our own examination, and I haven't done that. The team and I haven't done that for our data.
Yeah, that'd be interesting to, I mean, it's a great, I'm glad to see the increase. It'd be great to see, like, are we getting a lot more students in and therefore, or are we the same number of students but having more success? And then if we even had more students in, you see the numbers go up again. Interesting to see what that.
Can I have the next slide, please, Karen? Thank you. Our data are slightly better for CTE career pathway completion. Here, our historically underserved students increased in the completion of CTE pathways by almost 9 percentage points, 8.4 percentage points, up to 20.9 from 12.5 the prior year. For this indicator, all student groups showed increased performance as compared to 1920, though gaps are still persistent, as you can see on the screen. If I could have the next slide, and we can look at dual credit course pass rate.
Before you move on, also, the board made a decision on defining post-secondary readiness for CTE as 2 or more classes, but we also know that that is actually fluctuating. Do you want to say something about that upcoming change?
ODE is changing the requirement for completion of a program of study for CTE from 2 courses, how we've been measuring, to 3 courses starting next school year. So we, as a group, as a collective, I want to also consider adjusting our board goal to match the state requirement.
So the sort of needing to be iterative as information evolves. The good thing is our CTE programming has continued to evolve. We're seeing growth there for students that are choosing this pathway, showing some nice growth.
Thank you, Superintendent, and Dr. Hamel. For dual credit course pass rates, those increased for our underserved students of color, improving by 4.3 percentage points from 14.3 to 18.6% across the school years. The performance of all students, however, just decreased slightly, likely due to decreased performance on this particular indicator by our Asian, Native, and white students, as well as students with disabilities. So we had a number of groups that went down, and that likely caused some decrease in the all-student group. And finally, for post-secondary readiness, if I could have the next slide, we know that biliteracy is an asset in today's global society, and for this indicator, our underserved students of color improved by almost 10 percentage points from 1920 to 2021. Most recent performance saw 27.3% of underserved students earning the seal, up from 17.5% the prior year. That said, and here again, we see those gaps, and we see an indicator where fewer than 5% of our Black, Native, or Pacific Islander students actually earned the seal. So in conclusion, for post-secondary readiness, if I could have the next slide, we can see that our underserved students are making progress, and that's good news. We met and exceeded the board goal a year earlier than we anticipated. That's also good news. And we also see, to your point, Director, issues with access and opportunity. And so we see that For certain indicators, additional supports and access are needed for Black, Native, and Pacific Islander students. Those indicators include AP pass rate, IB pass rate, and the seal of biliteracy. And then for all indicators except CT pathway completion, we need additional supports and increased access for students with disabilities and our English learners. If I could have the next slide. This concludes our fall data dive. I want to thank you for the opportunity to present to you tonight. It's been my pleasure, and at this time, myself and the team are ready to take any questions you might have or engage in any discussion you might like, Director Constant.
So my first question would be around, we've just seen the impact from 1920 to 2021, but we also know that we have had a persistent achievement gap for a long time, and we've had a range of our students who have not been meeting benchmarks across grade levels for a long time. So even just anecdotally, can you kind of discuss that trend over the grade levels and the decrease from last year to this year relative to the trends that we've seen in, 5 years ago or something?
Well, we didn't display that tonight, so I don't want to speculate. But what we anticipate is, again, greater decreases in math than in reading. We knew and know that we have a math problem. That's why we've done a curricular adoption, and Dr. Proctor continues down that road. And so what we might anticipate and what we know is that we need to probably change some practices, because for our students who are behind to catch up, we need to accelerate their learning, right? So simply meeting your growth target every year on math is not going to cut it. You need to exceed your growth target year after year in order to catch up to your peers that are performing on grade level when you are not. And so I don't want to speculate. If you'll, I want to beg your pardon and not particularly speculate, but I'm happy to do those types of analyses and bring those back once we have growth data in the winter for the next data dive.
I had a couple questions. One was about the methodology with the population research. I was curious about the fidelity of the projections. I know it's a projection, but those projections are dependent on humans inputs into the system, and so I'm wondering what how that is going to be resolved. And then also I'm curious what that loss of enrollment, what does that mean in terms of our overall test scores and.
Okay, let me start with your first question.
I'm guessing, I'm hypothesizing that if we have higher income students leaving the district, I'm just curious what the impact of that would be on our overall.
Okay.
Or do we know the demographics?
Or do we know
disaggregated demographics of our?
I don't have the disaggregated demographics of the students who are no longer here tonight, but I can certainly work with the superintendent to provide that to you at a future meeting. So let's not necessarily speculate on that at the moment. We know that if you take an average and you take a bunch of hundreds and 90s out of the average tends to fall.
That's what I was kind of getting at. I was wondering if we have any guesses as to how that would impact the
Sure, but let's take a look at that. To your first question, Chair DePass, the pandemic has caused a lot of volatility, thank you, in the projections.
Yes.
So the idea that students are moving in ways that they had not historically, because the projection is based on past performance, right? You build a steady trend of what's going to happen based on what has happened for the past several years. And once the pandemic hit and we lost contact with students, we don't have them enrolled, well, they're withdrawn, we don't know where they've gone, they're not showing up in partner districts, so we can't really track where they are. That just really caused challenges with the projection. And so one of the things we're doing is still providing all of the demographic information we can to the Population Research Center. In addition, they are trying to combine that with data that they're understanding from neighboring districts to try to make a more conservative projection moving forward until such time as the model stabilizes, because we're still in the pandemic.
I sense that people are leaving the district because housing costs are high here. And I mean, just anecdotally, people are moving to cities that have a lower cost of living. And because, in some professions you can work from anywhere. And so I feel like that's part of the trend of leaving, is that people are realizing I can work from the beach, or I can work from a smaller town or whatever.
That very well could be.
And I'm just curious if the Population Research Center considers housing costs and the availability of housing here in Portland, it's a very tight market right now, so.
Let me investigate that and I can get back to you, because I'm not sure.
I think they might be in the right.
I don't want to misspeak. I saw Jackson's hand.
Yeah, one of the, I guess, like, limitations of winter 2020 was the, like, limited number of data points that or was it 20?
Winter
21, yes.
21.
We had limited data points and we had to extrapolate that data. So what were the, like, percentage participation from this fall?
So this fall excuse me, great question. Participation this time around was about 90% in reading and close to 90% in math. And that winter administration, the participation rate was a little higher than 65, 67%. So it's been greatly improved. In-person instruction, when you're in person, it's much easier to make sure students are taking the assessment to carve out that time instructionally, that 45 or 50-minute window that you need. And ensuring that that can happen remotely it was challenging.
Was it 90% across demographic groups?
No, it varies, but I don't have that with me, but I can tell you that it varies. It varies by school. We will be providing to the regional superintendents data that they can then understand similarly about their particular schools.
This is maybe not a question for you, Dr. Adams, but it's based on your data. So this is maybe a question for Dr. and Superintendent Guerrero. Looking at the achievement numbers, not only are they tracked historically, Black and Native students having, in some cases, single digits into a grade level, and actually further, the question is like, in a year in which we have more resources than we probably ever had, are we flooding those schools where those students are with both the social emotional supports but also the academic supports, or is this year going to just be that trend line is that trend line and next year's like a reset, or we have summer academies with extended learning? I guess it's like, what are we doing to there was a big inflection point, but in the wrong way because of the pandemic. It's like, are we doing something to move the inflection point measurably versus just continuing through the year?
Yeah, that's an essential question. I appreciate it. I'll start. Team to jump in, Dr. Bird, even Dr. Proctor, around the implications for. You saw it in the NWA data, right? It was already gaps in the circles, which only amplified the pandemic. And so the question for school systems and for PPS is, we haven't had all of our student groups at grade level expectation, and now we have even more ground to cover. And so you've started to see over the last couple of years a more equitable distribution of resources, whether that's staffing or students direct supports or partners in our CSI, PSI schools, and there's been some support plans in place. How do we continue to sort of ramp that up? We have some one-time monies right now to really address the issues that are becoming evident for us. And you'll hear about some of that as we go into budget development season after the winter break. But I'll invite team to talk about some of the work that we're doing, because these are essential questions for our school-based instructional leadership teams, for our principal supervisors, and for us centrally to think about what are the levers that are high leverage that are going to sort of disrupt this pattern and make up ground so that more of our students are at grade level. So, do you want to start with you?
Yeah, so in building a plan to earmark specific funds to address these gaps that we find, we of course brought in more resources into the CSI schools, staff to support the school's implementation of their school improvement plan. Many of the CSI schools are also engaged in a deep work with UVA in addition. And we've also identified a director for learning acceleration. With that work, through learning acceleration. For example, we are engaging in high quality or intensive tutoring for students in addition to Saturday programs and after school programs to help support and to bridge, build additional programming to support students in bridging those gaps that were, of course, impacted that you see in the data as a result of COVID and being absent from school and being away from the direct teaching that is necessary for students to really perform and to thrive in a learning environment. So we definitely have looked at that. In addition to in our high school space, we have identified and continue to work with student success teams in the high school space to have conversations about specific students and where there are gaps in their performance and how we can provide, again, additional supports for them. So there has been a plan that has been laid out how to use those resources, those additional resources that in this particular year coming back to face-to-face learning to support the students, and we'll continue to analyze data and analyze our programming, right? So part of what we are also doing is, if you look at the data and look at where we are, as it was noted that we have a math curriculum adoption that has happened this year, and also a curriculum adoption for pre-K2 for foundational skills. And we have to continue to track the implementation of it and track the student outcomes as a result, while at the same time we continue to engage in deep curriculum adoption across other content areas and grade levels for our system to really provide the resources for teachers to have a grade level, high quality grade level curriculum and resources to use in the classroom as well, where that has been a missing for a number of years here at PPS. And as you can see, without strong, high quality and aligned curriculum, we're then unable to meet some of these targets. So these are some of the things that we have in place and that we'll continue to do, and then track the data along the way so that we can continue to make adjustments for those students, all students.
Can I just recap that? So across the board, we're doing some foundational things, like the math curriculum, even if you're at your high achieving school or a TSI or CSI school, that's going to benefit everybody.
Absolutely.
And then layered over that, we have targeted accelerants.
Sure.
The tutoring, the extended year, extended day. And does our focus students, our WAC and native students, every single one of them have access to that?
They will, absolutely. It will be offered. What we're doing, for example, with our summer programming is another element, is ensuring that there are regional hubs across our city so that we can service all students, and we make it available to our performing students who need to have some skill development and to bridge some of the learning gaps.
Regardless of whether their own school is flooded with it or not. They can
Say that
still,
one more time.
regardless of whether their own school is flooded with it or not, they can still have access. Individuals can have access through those.
Yes.
No, the other thing that principals in our CSI schools talk about all the time is just the increased support and investment with our partners in all kinds of ways, from explicitly academic support to family support, social emotional support, and all that. That's much higher level.
Yeah, absolutely. We really invest deeply even in the SEL work. And that all of that is like a wraparound for ensuring that our students are really ready for learning. And if we're able to, for example, in the pre-K8 space, we have our schools that are engaging in morning meetings and having these, dialogues, circles, dialogues with students so that they can, I call it unpacking, their backpack emotionally before entering into the learning space so that they can engage deeply with their teachers and with their lessons.
So in addition to the additional staffing, APs, interventionists,
TOSA access, the cohort model, the technical assistance, UVA and others. You know, in order to make up those unfinished instruction or learning time, this is why you saw one of the deepest summer offerings and catalogs ever in the history of the district. And we'll need to continue that
Yes, we will.
going into the coming summer, on top of our 5 RESJ strategies around mentorship and wraparounds, case management. And we do want to get to the point to where we can be as exact as possible about making sure every student has the kind of supports and wraparounds that they'll have. So we had a vigorous conversation this morning, and just to kick off, you know, how does that inform the strategy that we're going to want to resource moving forward to make sure that we're really addressing that. So I know Norberto is probably already going to be holding us accountable to sort of how is this going to help move the needle where we most need to.
And I'll add, I think one of the through lines through that is to Superintendent Guerrero's point around leveraging one-time monies. So there's just this like real conversation to be had about building capacity, enhancing our capacity, and supporting with community feedback as well. So as we think about what the next 2 years are going to look like for our ESSER funding, so we have these federal dollars, we know that summer school was very successful, and there's like an opportunity there to continue to roll that out. So putting a stake in the ground around summer school funding, but then to Dr. Proctor's point around wraparound supports or high dosage tutoring, how do we continue to roll that through thoughtfully, knowing that we have these one-time funds that what we do thereafter and come fiscal year 24. So it's laying out the long-term plan, but be very thoughtful and immediate impact. That those are some of the upcoming conversations we'll continue.
Somebody else had a question. So I have a question in response to that. So with low enrollment that we're seeing and the one-time funding that we're getting, how sustainable are the implementation of things that we're putting in place? That's one. Next question is, what plan do we have in place if and when funding decreases for the district, whether it's due to low enrollment or state revenues is lower? What plan do we have in place to combat that?
So the biggest anchor in our plan is going to be Forward Together. It's going to be our strategic plan and how we're aligning our resources to that. And at the same time, we'll be leveraging the ESSER funding that we have, so our federal relief dollars, to help cushion as we go through the next few years. There will be just some natural adjustments based on our staffing plan, less students, there'll be less, naturally like some staffing adjustments that will happen by default, but also just understanding of what are those fiscal levers that we need to be mindful of, from how are we leveraging existing resources to support a specific goal. So whether that goal is continuing summer school every summer. So if we say summer school is going to look like ABC, and this is something we're going to do moving forward, how do we help build how do we use those ESSER dollars to get us in a place to continue using our regular or our traditional funds to continue that work? Now, the reality is there also will be trade-off conversations and understanding how does this program, this initiative support the strategic plan. So one of the, it's a pie, not a well, right? So as we've been communicating and putting like the tone in place, right? It's like, what are the things that we're going to be focusing on? And keeping in mind, our resources are a pie, not a well. And what then do we put our focus in, but then also leverage our ESSER funding to just continue to enhance that, knowing that in 2 years, there's a fiscal cliff, right? Because that money goes away. So how does that fiscal cliff end up being a 2-foot drop versus a 30,000-foot drop? And so these are just ongoing conversations. It's not like having a set, what's this going to look like? we don't know where the state's going to be in another year or the next biennium as well. So there's like all these factors that come into play, but that still behooves us to have these trade-off conversations and assessing how we're aligning to our strategic plan.
And then there are some investments that have long-term benefit, like professional development.
Yes, that isn't a perfect example of building capacity. So it's like investing in professional development, because then that continues to pay off. And so it's that upfront investment that then gets us going for the next few years, or hopefully for infinity.
So when you talk about like the district strategy that comes into place, and I know this is a kind of hypothetical question, but you know, how long are we looking for all the things that we're putting in place to start seeing a positive result? Because historically, it's just been going the opposite direction.
And the key to that is going to be the outcome. So in our strategic plan, we have our goals and our outcomes. And one of the things that we're doing is identifying which ones are we going to focus on as we get through, because as we all should, we should always raise the bar. Just like we want to raise the bar for our students, we should be raising the bar for ourselves and how we push the work forward. And part of that is understanding the sequencing of that strategic plan. So based on, are we going to be focusing on, the one that selfishly comes to mind is thinking about a strategic deployment office, or thinking about like a core team that's going to focus on the strategic outcomes and delivering or keeping track of the strategy. So as Dr. Adams' teams continues to put all the information together, how are we keeping track of that data to keep us accountable for the results? And so, as an example, as we think about our internal resources, how do we then put ourselves in a position to continue through with the rest of the plan? And so, if we're looking at data from our summer programs, how then do we continue to tweak to achieve and continue that work? And so as the team continues to assess what are the outcomes that we want to focus on for the next year, and then so forth, and continue to build on that, it's going to be, it's not going to be a set, like this is it, but it's going to be the continued evolution of our strategic plan based on the outcomes that we initiate with first.
Okay, so I kind of get what you're saying, but usually, so when we implement something at our company, we have a outcome point to say, okay, we should get this outcome if we implement this today. So that's kind of what I'm looking at now. Is like, with the stuff that we're implementing today, what time frame are we looking for some kind of outcome for our students to move up?
I will.
Dr.
Adams
jump
wants
in,
to
sure.
chime in. But one thing I will add is, as conversation, for example, is board goals. So when we're thinking about reading, math proficiency, it's not thinking so much about it from a time-bound perspective, but like the principal conversations we've been having is around how do we start looking at our resources to start having that engagement conversation based on what's happening at our schools to achieve those goals. And I don't know, Dr. Renard, if Dr.
I'm used to that. A lot of people are saying that when I run into them, it's fine. What I would offer Director Hollins is there are many, our research and education tells us that there are many different inputs that are happening that go into student achievement and student outcomes. You need a guaranteed and viable curriculum. You need a certificated, highly qualified and highly effective teacher. You need facilities that are welcoming and inviting and make students feel comfortable. And so what I would offer is we have, in my being new, I think we have lots to still examine to understand which might be the biggest levers that we then want to really push the handles down on to figure out how to get the outcomes that we all want for our students as quickly as we can. We need ongoing professional support. There are just so many different things. And I think we have to wrestle with what are those high leverage activities that we can do. what are the low leverage, low outcome activities we can stop doing, and how do we then obtain the outcomes for students that we want. Change takes time, and an organization like this is the Titanic, not a speedboat, and so we don't necessarily turn those corners as quickly as you would often like to, but you can turn the corner with time and the appropriate effort.
But do we have an anticipated time frame that we're looking to steer the Titanic in a different direction? I guess I'm looking at it as a parent, right? If I have a second grade kid coming into the school district, and as a Black kid, and I see the numbers that's there, am I waiting 10 years for this stuff to happen? Or am I waiting 5 years for the shift to switch?
Right.
I mean, what am I looking at?
So how I wanna, answer that for you, Dr. Hollins, is, there are two ways of looking at it. Yes, that we are a ship and we do need time. It's gonna take a lot of inputs and such. One of the greatest inputs and levers that occur, two of them specifically, to increase student learning is curriculum, high quality curriculum, and high quality teacher practices, right? And every day, teaching and learning should be occurring in every single school in our system. And every week or every couple of weeks, the good teacher, high quality teacher, is going to make some measure of assessment to see if students are learning and growing in his or her environment. So while we are working, just because of, you can look at it broad scale, and then as a, to address the parent in all of us, say that, we are in the process of curriculum adoption. We are in the process of ensuring that students have access to high quality curriculum. And we are in the process of shifting some practices that we have seen trending in the classroom that with improvement can improve student outcomes. So it could be, right, as far as the scale for the organizational shift, it will take, right, anyone who knows change management will tell you that it takes anywhere from 3 to 5 years to even start seeing that large scale shift. But if we keep an eye and we support our schools and our leaders in schools on how to keep an eye on the day-to-day practices and instruction within the classroom, there is no reason that we can't get to every child within a shorter period of time, whether it be year over year with improved practice and improved curriculum.
Can I pick up on that line? Because I mean, Dr. Hollins, your question is getting at what I think we're all thinking. I think it's safe to say, I mean, every single person in this room wants to see the student achievement grow, particularly these gaps, as quickly as we can. Do it in 6 months, that's great. If we can only do it in 4 or 5 years, let's start moving towards that. I think the inherent tension that we're seeing, and we always will see, is, staff are going to justifiably, not set expectations unreasonably high, right? And this is true with any performance management exercise. We want to set stretch goals that we can achieve, not unattainable goals that we're going to fail to achieve. What I'm hearing, which I think is good for us as board members to hear, is, look, some of this stuff is going to take a lot of time. And I think the tension, and what I hope we continue to have as a conversation is, as board members, we're going to be pushing to say, can we do it faster? Can we do it faster? And I think the response from the superintendent and you all is, well, first of all, there's a resource constraint. It's a pie, right? And then even if we can do additional resources, there's a point where it's still going to take time. I mean, even if, with the 10, 20, $30 million,
to scale, right?
It's going to take time to scale. And so I think it's incumbent on us to push really hard for that accountability and also be realistic with the public in terms of what we can achieve. And I think it's going to be the inherent tension as we go through the conversation. But I love the question because we keep asking it every time. We ask it every board meeting, right? Like, what are we doing this week to move this forward?
Right. No, I definitely appreciate the question. If we could stay on that question and focus our intentional efforts, I think we'll see short-term wins while we build for long-term success.
Sure.
And we've already seen in this district, when we're focused, when we stay on a high school student success plan, we're building out our CTE programs. We saw the data, fantastic in post-secondary readiness. And we're on the right track. We're seeing some nice growth, and we want to maintain that trajectory. when we see what's happening in early education, when we see what's happening in our foundational literacy work. I mean, the reading data stayed in a pretty good place. So we must have been doing some work there, and we have lots more to go. But does that have anything to do with the first dose of a lot of our PE was focused on foundations in reading and science and reading and dyslexia, and we saw lots of that work being pushed out. Maybe that factored in. I don't think it's any one lever. I think it is a combination of the inputs. I think what we have to ask ourselves is, as we build up capacity across the organization and the system, what's the concerted, more focused attention we're going to give students in the schools they're at, where we know they need the benefit of acceleration, more interventions, more supports, more time, and continue to sort of be equitable and have them support them.
And I love the idea as you talk about focusing in on the problems to make them manageable, right? And I'm thinking back to, homelessness is sort of an unsolvable problem, but veterans homelessness, when the federal government said this is going to be prioritized, they kicked a whole bunch of money in, they told states and counties, you got to focus on it. All of a sudden, they solved veterans homelessness, at least briefly. And I think it's the same thing when we talk about Black student achievement, it feels almost, like, wow, how are we going to get around that? If you talk about the 10 Black students at this school, who are, not reading at grade level, and how do we bring them up to grade level? All of a sudden it feels more manageable. And I know that's what you've been doing, since I got here, right? Is sort of how do we get the resources to those schools? How do we get the focus on it? And I think the more we break it down into those manageable pieces, that we can see that result.
And it's those cycles of continuous improvement. It's those plan, do, study, act conversations our principal supervisors are having with their cohorts of schools. Let's pull out our improvement plans. Is the data, now that we have this baseline, do we still think these are the right action steps we should be putting our attention on? It's a constant conversation around how do we make adjustments and fine tune, and what are we learning from schools that, when we disaggregate by school site, that are showing actually some admirable gains. What is it that they're doing on those campuses that we might learn from those best practices around? So this is why professional learning community time is important. For our teachers to have opportunities to do learning walks, for our principals to be engaged in instructional rounds, for us to be engaged with partners out there like UVA to sort of support, provide technical assistance, refine our leaders' lenses so that they're giving guidance and feedback to our educators. So we're all calibrated around what we think high quality, effective instruction looks like, and that the evidence is always on what the students are demonstrating that they've learned. That has to be sort of the measure. Our students learning, what does it look like when it's at grade level? Yes, we have to scaffold from where students are at, but we also have to provide grade level content. And so sometimes we forget that there may be some extra work that we need to do there, but as you saw, we have some student groups that are more than a grade level behind. That doesn't mean they don't get the grade level that they're in with the content. We just have to put it in an accessible, comprehensible way for them. Whether they're a student group below grade level, or an English learner, or a student with disabilities, they're all entitled to that kind of access.
Which sounds so eminently sensible, but 2 years ago, we didn't have that. We did not have that across our district. Universal, standards-based, aligned curriculum.
I want to let Director Hollins know I asked the exact same question. I put it in the context of a parabola. At what point do we start to see that curve, the growth curve, dramatically?
And it is a curve that's hopefully goes steep. It's not a linear line northeast. It's not a diagonal. It's this. But if we stay focused, and when we do, we see visible improvements.
I'm going to ask my last question. So as a board or as a board member, what can we do to assist this process?
When we stay focused on student achievement, keep doing the main thing, then you expect to see the growth that I think that we all feel an urgency.
One of the things on this page stuck out to you that it's another request. Looking through the charts, it's also a little bit dangerous because if you look at one point, it's like, hey, we're actually doing okay. And it's because that's when we're looking at the averages. And it's like, this is like the myth of Portland, like we're above average because, you know, frankly, we have a lot of white middle class students, and those students are masking the discrepancy. So I say when I went through the slides at the start, it was like, oh, hey, this is actually not bad. And then it's like, oh, you know, because then you get away from it. What would be helpful for me is to see the not just the percentage, but the number of students there, because if you look at it, it's like 2 bars actually maps all this other the levels of the achievement gaps because of just the demographics of our district. So it would be really helpful to have by bar how many students that is. Because I think that allows this sort of intensity of focus versus like, hey, we're actually above average in reading, but that gets us distracted, I think, from, or unfocused from what we really need to focus on, which is students and how many are there and where are they? And are we applying the maximize resources? The most experienced principals in those schools and all the other things that need to happen.
Duly noted. I looked at the reading data, and while in aggregate it tells a nice story, I think once I started disaggregating, I thought, what could these bars look like if we were teaching our Black and brown students to read at grade level expectation? How much higher should those bars be if we're actually meeting the promise of that free, appropriate public education for all of our students?
Not to measure all the other aspects of our vision and what we want for our children that are being impeded because we're not setting them up to succeed in their most fundamental proficiencies. You know, all those other things in terms of realizing their whole self.
Dr. Adams, you know, talking about goal setting, you and I talked about this earlier. We have this data point. We're going to get an additional data point with the winner. Mass testing. At what point? I mean, we have board goals we adopted 2 years ago that are actually through the 21-22 school year at the end of this. But we sort of acknowledge as a board the need to reset that baseline, which you talked about tonight. So when will we have the data needed to reset that baseline and then start talking about these questions of how quickly can we get there? 2%, 5%, 10%.
What I would say is I believe we'd be able to have that conversation in the spring. We need to have the winter data, look at our trajectory from this fall to this winter compared to some past trajectories when we that were perhaps in place based on past data when the board accepted and voted on and approved those goals. That will give us an idea, sort of like the NWA chart where it had the 2 lines of trajectory, one was solid and one was dotted. That'll give us an idea around how much we need to adjust. I'm also going to lean heavily on our partners at NWA who have so much knowledge and have so much support to offer in terms of helping us set those targets that are rigorous and yet attainable for the district and for students. Let's bring.
I don't know if you guys want to add anything, but it's exactly the question that school boards around the country are wrestling with, right? Or my colleagues saying, well, there's been this disruption, so how do we recalibrate? What makes for an ambitious stretch goal still? But thankfully, we have a resource here where the trajectory can be informative to that question for us.
We talked before about having a session with our head of learning acceleration to see what we can understand about the relationship between some of our investments and the assessments of our kids, so that, you know, which is really critical information that we need for our budget process, so that we know what to double down on to really have an impact on student achievement. So I hope that we do still have that conversation.
Yeah, I know we're already starting to think about it because there's the academic need, there's the social emotional need, and I think help keep a lot of our kids safe this past summer as well. So those are all sort of benefits that we think are in return from that continued investment.
I mean, I have to also say, like, that was one of my questions to Director Hollins. This is just such an extraordinary year. I think your question or your comment about safety, like, we have to kind of triage right now. Like, how do you keep kids safe? Teachers safe. And it's not what I want to focus on necessarily. I'd like to focus on those gaps. It's kind of like what's on first.
Heavy on our hearts today.
It's heavy on our hearts, and it's just stressful when you open a newspaper. Still read newspapers sometimes, by the way. Yeah, it's triage. It feels like a battlefield.
So the conditions have certainly changed, and we'll need to also, the good thing is, we were having these conversations during our student investment account development, and so thankfully, we had some of the resources that maybe other districts hadn't anticipated as something a district should be equipped with, so we actually ended up being in a pretty good place, comparatively speaking, but we want to look at those too, which ones have proved really valuable, and where do we need to sort of expand on some of those efforts to meet students' readiness to learn challenges, as well as the academic interventions and acceleration that we want to see. So yes, you can of course look forward to, as we gather internally and bring in school-based leaders in these conversations after the break, to start to formulate, not only what aspects of our strategic plan are we going to prioritize in sequence to get at some of those short-term wins, how do we stay on this journey to build overall capacity, and then what are some more immediate needs that this pandemic has, and how do we leverage the various funding revenue streams, including the ones that are temporary, that maybe can help us build capacity.
I mean, as stressful as this time is right now, also I think I see through to some opportunities. And as difficult as it is, I do see some opportunities to reform, even how we're thinking about how we're problem solving. Our problem solving hasn't gotten us where it hasn't solved problems with that children.
And as challenging as it is to think about the work ahead of us, like, we have an amazing team. So thank you guys, thank you both for your leadership tonight on this work.
Well, this is intended to be an ongoing series, looking at a myriad of indicators. This one is obviously, we were very curious to see what our fall assessment data looked like. There's a number of other areas we want to look at. They might not be board goal related, but they definitely tell us something about the inputs of the investments and where we're at with those. So I think you can look forward to how we schedule future work sessions on some of those topic areas. And then we'll come back to these charts after the winter assessment. Dr. Renard?
Is there anything else?
Directors, anything further?
No, nothing further.
I just want to say, I know that this information is hard to hear. It's not hard to say and speak. I mean, it is hard to say and speak to. And I knew I would be taking the air out of the room with this presentation tonight. But what I know from my work in previous districts, it is possible to close gaps. I worked in a system where we closed the gap in graduation rate between Black and white students. When we have school improvement plans that focus on student achievement and student belonging, and we have staff focused on 2 to 3 things that they need to improve professionally in their practice with appropriate curricular supports and PD, we will see the results we want to see. We'll get there.
All right, we're gonna hold you to that.
Hold us to it. Collectively, it's all of us together.
Everybody.
Hold each other. We hold each other into account. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.